A wealthy boss callously fires a black woman after getting her pregnant. Little does he know, this decision will eventually cost him everything he has built throughout his life. Richard Caldwell sat at his desk, his fingers drumming on the glossy mahogany surface. It was a Friday afternoon, and all he could think about was escaping to the golf course, leaving the stress of his corporate empire behind. Being one of the richest men in the city brought its share of headaches. But today felt different. His body hummed with a strange unease, as if something ominous was looming. The air in his office seemed unusually thick, but he couldn't pinpoint why. Then it happened. The door swung open, revealing a face he hadn't seen in decades. Time had softened her features, but those eyes, he would never forget those eyes. Eyes filled with quiet resilience and a history of struggles. Richard froze for a moment, uncertain whether to stand, speak, or simply stay put. His heart pounded in his chest harder than it had in years. It was her, the woman he had let go all those years ago, the woman he had wronged, the one he had tried to erase from his memory. And now, she stood before him. But for what reason? A lump formed in his throat, and his hands trembled despite his attempts to steady them. Before he could ask what she was doing here, she spoke. "Hello, Richard." Her voice was steady, but those two words hit him like a punch, knocking the breath from his lungs. He didn't have time to respond before the door creaked shut behind her, and the realization hit him. There was no way out. He was face to face with the consequences of his past. His mind flashed back to that day. The day he had made a decision that changed everything. But that was decades ago. Why had she come now? What did she want? A cold sweat beaded down his back. This wasn't just a casual visit. 25 years earlier. Richard hadn't always been a man of wealth. In the early days, he worked tirelessly to build his company from the ground up. He hired bright, driven employees and expanded quickly. That's when he met her, Angela Robinson. Angela was a standout in the legal department, sharp and always ahead of the curve. Richard depended on her, appreciating her intelligence and professionalism. But Angela was also different in another way. She was one of the few women of color in the company. Richard had prided himself on being progressive, believing her race didn't matter. At least, that's what he told himself. Eventually, their interactions crossed a line. Friendly exchanges turned into late-night dinners and conversations that went too far. Richard was married, but that didn't stop him. He chased after Sharon, making promises he had no intention of keeping. When she told him she was pregnant, Angela hoped Richard would stand by her. She wanted him to take responsibility, but Richard had other plans. He couldn't afford a scandal that might destroy his reputation or his business. So, he made a heartless decision. He fired her. And it wasn't just a simple firing. Richard used his power to ensure she couldn't find work in the industry again, blacklisting her completely. Angela was left alone to raise their child, with no job and no support. Over the years, Richard convinced himself it was necessary. He had to protect his company, his family, and his future. Angela became a memory he buried deep, never thinking it would resurface, present day. But now, here she was, standing in the office he had built through his hard-fought success. And this wasn't just about old mistakes. There was something deeper in her eyes, something more than mere vengeance. Angela had always carried herself with dignity, but now there was a weight in her presence that was impossible to ignore. Richard cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. "Sharon, what brings you here?" Her lips curled into a small, almost bitter smile. "What do you think, Richard?" she replied. Before he could answer, Angela reached into her bag and placed an envelope on his desk. Richard stared at it, a sense of dread creeping over him. "Open it," she said, her tone calm but firm. His hand trembled slightly as he ripped open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The moment he read the first few lines, his world crumbled. It wasn't just the mention of the child, their child, that made his heart race. It was the revelation that their son, now a grown man, had already entered his life in the most unexpected way. Before he could process it all, Sharon's voice cut through his thoughts. "Richard, meet your son. He's been closer than you think." The office door creaked open again, and a shadow fell across Richard's desk. He realized who it was. Standing in the doorway was his new lawyer, the one he had recently hired to manage his growing legal issues. Bright, talented, someone Richard admired. But now, the truth hit him hard. This wasn't just his lawyer, this was his son. Richard's mind raced. How had he not noticed? The resemblance was undeniable, those sharp eyes, the confidence, the quiet determination. His son had been right in front of him the entire time. Before Richard could even comprehend the situation, Sharon's voice broke the silence once more. "This is just the beginning, Richard. You thought you could forget about me, about us. But you can't outrun your past." Richard's heart pounded harder, the room closing in around him. He tried to speak, but no words came. His past was catching up to him, and karma had just walked through his door. The tension was unbearable. Richard stared at the young man in front of him, his son, the child he had abandoned before he was even born. The young man's presence felt like the final crack in the foundation of Richard's empire. His mind searched for an explanation, a way out, anything to regain control. But for the first time in his life, Richard was speechless. His son stood tall, arms crossed, unreadable. There was something in his eyes, a drive, an ambition that Richard recognized in himself. Richard had always prided himself on reading people, understanding their motives. But this was different. Sharon's voice sliced through the silence. "Say something, Richard." He opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. No words would come. His son, his flesh and blood, was standing before him, no longer a child, but a man with a career, a life, a future that Richard had no part in. Richard Jr., the name his father never knew, had been prepared for this moment, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the sight of his father breaking down in front of him. Finally, Richard managed to speak, his voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." "You didn't want to know," Angela responded coldly, her arms crossed. "You made your choice a long time ago." A wave of guilt crashed over Richard, threatening to swallow him whole. He had convinced himself that what he did was necessary, that there was no other option but to sever ties with Angela and protect his career. But now, standing in the same room with the son he had never acknowledged, he realized the cost of those decisions was far greater than he had ever imagined. Richard Jr. took a step forward, breaking the thick silence. "I don't need anything from you, Richard," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I didn't come here to ask for money or favors. I came here because I wanted you to see what you gave up." Richard felt his chest tighten. The words hit harder than he had expected. He had always told himself that the people he hurt along the way were just obstacles, necessary sacrifices on the road to success. But now, staring into his son's eyes, he saw the human cost of his ambition in a way he had never allowed himself to before. "Look," Richard began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I made mistakes. I thought I was doing what I had to do at the time, but that doesn't mean I didn't care." Angela scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Care? You fired me when I told you I was pregnant. You didn't just fire me, Richard. You destroyed my career, made sure no one would hire me. I had to start over, raising our son on my own." Richard felt a rush of shame, but before he could respond, His son spoke again. "Don't make this about you," Richard Jr. said, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't about you saving your career or feeling guilty now. You made your choices, and we lived with them. You don't get to rewrite the story just because it's convenient for you." Richard flinched at his son's words. He had always been in control, always the one with the power in every room. But now he felt powerless. The office, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Sharon's voice softened slightly, though it still had an edge. "We're not here to ruin you, Richard. I built my life, and our son has built his. We've moved on. But you need to understand that the decisions you made don't just vanish. The past doesn't stay buried." Richard sank heavily into his chair, his mind racing. His hands rested in his lap, trembling slightly. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had spent years building an empire, becoming untouchable. But now, the very foundation of his success was crumbling beneath him. He looked up at his son again. "What do you want from me?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Why now? Why come back after all these years?" Richard Jr. stared at him for a long moment before speaking, his voice quiet but resolute. "I wanted you to know that I'm not here because of you. I've made something of myself, without your help, without your name. I wanted you to see the man you gave up. And I wanted you to know that you don't have power over me." A heavy silence followed. Richard's throat tightened as the reality settled in. This wasn't about money or revenge. It was about showing him the truth that his decisions had consequences. Consequences that no amount of wealth or power could erase. Angela stepped forward and placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "We're leaving, Richard. I didn't come for your apologies or your guilt. I came because our son wanted you to see him for who he is, not as some shadow of your past." Richard Jr. turned to leave, but paused at the door. He glanced back at Richard, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. Disappointment, perhaps, but not hatred. "You'll never know me, Richard, and that's your loss." With that, he walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Richard sat there, staring at the closed door, feeling an emptiness he hadn't felt in years. The room was eerily quiet now. His mind replayed the events of the past hour over and over, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He'd always thought of himself as untouchable, above the consequences of his actions. But now, faced with the reality of the family he had abandoned, he realized he had lost something far more valuable than wealth or success. He had lost his son, but the story wasn't over. Not for Richard, and certainly not for Angela and their son. As Richard sat there, trying to gather his thoughts, he knew deep down this was only the beginning. The past had come back to haunt him, and karma wasn't done with him yet. The office felt colder now. Richard remained seated at his desk, his eyes fixed on the closed door. For the first time in his life, he couldn't move. It was as if the weight of everything he had done, everything he had built, was pressing down on him all at once. His heart pounded in his chest, not from anger, but from fear. Fear of what would happen next. His son, his own flesh and blood, had walked out of his life just as quickly as he had entered. But the moment lingered, wrapping itself around Richard like chains. What Angela had said was true. The past never stays buried. He had spent decades trying to cover it up, convincing himself it didn't matter. But now, karma had come knocking, and it wasn't going away. Richard reached for his glass of water, his hand trembling as he lifted it to his lips. The cool liquid did little to calm his nerves. His mind raced, struggling to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. His son had made something of himself, an accomplished lawyer, no less, and without any help from Richard. In fact, Richard hadn't even known his son's name until today. He had never asked, never wondered. But now everything was different. Richard tried to focus on the tasks ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to Angela and their son. He glanced around his luxurious office, at the expensive artwork, the leather chairs, the breathtaking view of the city skyline. This was the empire he had sacrificed so much for. But in the end, what had he really gained? Leaning back in his chair, Richard closed his eyes as memories flooded back. 25 years earlier, it had been a rainy afternoon when Angela knocked on his office door for the last time. Richard remembered it as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. She looked different that day, exhausted, as though the weight of the world had finally worn her down. "Richard," she had said quietly, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you. It's important." He had barely glanced up from his work, too consumed with the latest business deal. "Make it quick, Sharon. I've got a meeting in 10 minutes. I'm pregnant." Those two words had sliced through the air, freezing Richard in his seat. He had finally looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time in weeks. There was no denying the seriousness in her tone, the fear hidden behind her calm expression. "What are you talking about?" he had asked, his voice low and cold. "You heard me," she had said, barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant. It's yours." Richard had stared at her, time standing still as the reality sank in. He had never imagined something like this happening, not to him. He had always been careful, always made sure his personal life didn't interfere with his business. But now, here was Sharon, standing in his office, telling him she was carrying his child. His first instinct had been to deny it, to make the problem disappear. "You can't keep it," he had said bluntly, his tone sharp. "You know what this would do to me, to us. We can't have this ruin everything." Sharon's eyes had filled with tears, but she stood her ground. "I'm keeping the baby, Richard. I won't let you talk me out of it." He had felt the walls closing in, the fear of losing everything he had worked for, tightening around his throat. "If you keep it, Sharon, you're out. I can't have this. Not now. Not ever." And just like that, he made his decision. He fired her on the spot, leaving her to fend for herself, pregnant and alone. It was a cold, heartless move, but Richard convinced himself it was the only way. He had told himself Angela would be fine, that she was strong enough to move on. And over the years, he buried the memory of that day deep inside, telling himself it was necessary, present day. Now, sitting in his office, Richard felt the full weight of that decision. He had chosen his empire over his own child, and while he had gained immense wealth and power, he realized he had lost something far more important. The room was silent, but the sound of his phone ringing pierced the quiet. He glanced at the screen. It was his lawyer. For a moment, Richard considered ignoring the call, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. He picked up the phone, his voice tense. "Yes? Richard, we need to talk." The lawyer's voice was serious. "There's a new lawsuit coming your way. This one might hit harder than we expected." Richard felt his stomach drop. Another lawsuit. He had been fighting legal battles for years, but something in his lawyer's tone told him this one was different. "What's this about?" Richard asked, trying to sound calm. "It's from Angela Robinson. She's suing for wrongful termination and defamation." Richard's blood ran cold. Angela was suing him. After all these years, "She has a solid case," the lawyer continued. "If this goes to court, it could get ugly." Richard gripped the phone tighter. This was the last thing he needed. Angela had been silent for decades, but now she was coming after him. And his company was already facing challenges from other legal issues. "How much does she want?" Richard asked, his voice strained. "It's not just about money, Richard," the lawyer replied. "She's asking for an apology, a public one. Richard clenched his jaw. A public apology. He had spent years cultivating his image as a powerful and respected figure. A public apology would be seen as weakness. It would destroy everything he had built. "I'm not giving her that," Richard said firmly. "Find another way to make this go away." "I'll do what I can," the lawyer replied, "but this isn't going to be easy. Sharon's son is part of her legal team now, and from what I've seen, he's a top-tier lawyer. This won't go away quietly." Richard felt his heart sink. His own son, the child he had abandoned, was now part of the legal team coming after him. The irony was unbearable. He had spent his life avoiding responsibility, and now the very son he had left behind was coming for him. "Just handle it," Richard said sharply before hanging up. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The cracks in his empire were starting to show. Angela had returned, and she wasn't backing down. His son, his own flesh and blood, was now leading the charge against him. Richard's world was unraveling, piece by piece, and he had no idea how to stop it. But he knew this was only the beginning. The phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. It was his assistant, reminding him of a board meeting in half an hour. Business as usual. No one else knew what was happening behind closed doors, and for now, he had to keep it that way. Richard stood, straightened his suit, and caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of the office window. For the first time in his life, the man staring back at him looked fragile, vulnerable. The carefully crafted image he had built was starting to crack, and deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. Richard stepped into the boardroom, his face a mask of control. He had learned long ago how to separate his personal problems from business, and, to his board members, he was still the sharp, calculating CEO who had built an empire from nothing. But inside, Richard was unraveling. He had barely made it through the meeting, his thoughts constantly drifting back to Sharon, to their son, to the looming lawsuit that threatened to expose everything, his past, his cold decisions, his failures. The thought of a public apology turned his stomach. How could he apologize for something he had spent his whole life justifying? He had made those choices to protect himself, his business. At least, that's what he had always believed. As Richard returned to his private office, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. It was Cassandra, his longtime assistant. She had been by his side for years, through every success and failure. But even she didn't know the full story about Angela and his son. "Mr. Caldwell," Cassandra called as she hurried after him. "I need to go over some urgent matters regarding the shareholder meeting next week. They're expecting updates on the latest acquisition." Richard nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He glanced at Cassandra, noticing the concern in her eyes. She had seen him weather storms before, but this time, it was different. "Can we discuss it later, Cassandra?" Richard said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I have something else to handle right now." Cassandra blinked in surprise at his tone, but nodded. "Of course, sir. Let me know when you're ready." Richard turned and walked into his office, shutting the door behind him. He leaned against the door for a moment, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. The room, once a symbol of his power and success, now felt like a prison. Crossing the room, he sank into the leather chair behind his massive desk, resting his head in his hands. His thoughts swirled in a chaotic mix of regret, fear, and anger. How had things spiraled out of control so quickly? Just days ago, everything seemed fine. Now his carefully constructed world was falling apart, and he didn't know how to fix it. The lawsuit was just the beginning. Angela had stayed quiet for years, but now she was coming for him, with their son by her side. Richard Jr., a highly successful lawyer with a reputation for winning tough cases, was the last person Richard expected to face in a courtroom, but here they were. A knock on the door pulled Richard out of his thoughts. He straightened up, trying to regain his composure. "Come in," he called out, his voice steadier now. The door opened, and Cassandra stepped in holding a folder. "There's someone here to see you, sir," she said, her voice low. It was Richard Jr. Richard's heart skipped a beat. His son was back, and this time he wasn't leaving quietly. "Send him in," Richard said after a brief pause, trying to maintain his composure. Cassandra nodded and left, and moments later, Richard Jr. entered the office. He looked even more composed than before, his dark suit sharp, his eyes focused and intense. There was a calm confidence in his steps, a confidence that reminded Richard of himself in his prime, ruthless and unwavering. "Hello again, Richard," his son said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge of intensity. "I thought we should talk." Richard motioned for him to sit, but Richard Jr. remained standing, arms crossed. The silence between them grew thick, stretching into an unbearable moment before Richard finally spoke. "What do you want?" Richard asked, tension woven into every word. "Your mother is already suing me. What more is there to discuss?" Richard Jr. raised an eyebrow. "I'm not here to talk about the lawsuit, at least not entirely. I'm here because I think you owe us more than just money. You owe my mother and me an explanation." Richard's chest tightened. An explanation? Where could he even begin? He had spent his life avoiding explanations, justifying his decisions to himself and moving forward without looking back. But now, his son was standing in front of him, demanding answers. "I made choices," Richard began slowly, carefully measuring each word. "Choices I had to make at the time. You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Richard Jr. shot back, his tone challenging. "You made those choices for yourself, not for us. You didn't just leave my mother, you tried to erase us." The accusation hit Richard like a blow. He had never framed it that way in his mind, but hearing his son say it, the truth of it stung. "I was building something," Richard said, his voice quieter now, "something bigger than myself. I didn't think I could be a father and do what needed to be done." Richard Jr. let out a bitter laugh. "So you just fired my mum and pretended we didn't exist? That's your excuse?" Frustration surged through Richard. "You don't get it. I was under pressure. I had to make sacrifices." "And we were your sacrifices," Richard Jr. said, his voice growing colder. "You didn't even try. You chose your empire over us." Richard couldn't argue. The truth in his son's words left him speechless. The weight of his decisions had never felt as heavy as they did now. With his son standing before him, demanding answers Richard wasn't sure he had. "What do you want from me?" Richard finally asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Do you want money? A public apology? What will it take to end this?" Richard Jr. stared at him for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. "This isn't about money. It's about you understanding what you did. You've spent your entire life hiding behind this company, pretending you're invincible. But you're not, and now it's time to face the consequences." Richard clenched his jaw. "So what? You're just going to destroy me?" Richard Jr. stepped closer, his eyes hard and unrelenting. "You destroyed yourself, Richard. You just didn't realize it until now." The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, neither spoke. Richard could feel the walls closing in, the reality of his past mistakes catching up to him in ways he had never anticipated. Before he could respond, the door to his office opened again. Cassandra stepped inside, looking nervous. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Caldwell, "There's an urgent call for you," she said, glancing between the two men. "It's about the company." Richard's heart sank. What now? He waved Cassandra off, but Richard Jr. spoke up before she could leave. "No, let her stay," Richard Jr. said, his voice steady. "You might want to hear this." Cassandra hesitated but stayed, holding the phone in her hand. "This isn't just about the lawsuit," Richard Jr. continued, his tone steady and controlled. "This is bigger than that. You thought you could sweep everything under the rug, but things are coming to light. The board, the shareholders, they're starting to ask questions, and they're not happy with what they're finding." Richard's stomach twisted. The empire he had built, brick by brick, seemed to be cracking at the foundation. If the shareholders turned against him, everything he had worked for could crumble. "Your secrets are coming out, Richard," his son said, his voice cold. "The people you hurt, the deals you made, the things you thought you buried, they're all coming back, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Richard stared at his son, the weight of his words settling in. He had always believed he could control everything, but for the first time, he felt utterly powerless. The phone in Cassandra's hand seemed to grow heavier as Richard reached for it. His son stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his face unreadable, waiting for the inevitable fallout. Richard hesitated before pressing the phone to his ear, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. "This is Richard," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Alex from Legal," came the voice on the other end. "I'm afraid we've hit a serious issue. We just received notice that several of your business deals from the past decade are being called into question." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" "Some of your past mergers and acquisitions. There are claims that certain financial documents were falsified to make the deals go through. We're looking at a potential investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The shareholders are already buzzing about it." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. An SEC investigation. That would be catastrophic. The board, the shareholders, the media, they would tear him apart. His empire wouldn't survive that kind of scrutiny. "I didn't falsify anything," Richard said sharply, though a cold dread was creeping in. He had always pushed the limits, making deals with questionable tactics, but he never believed it would catch up to him. He had always managed to keep it quiet, keep people in line. "Well, the allegations are serious," Alex continued, "and there's more. Some whistleblowers have come forward. People from inside your company. They're providing evidence that could back up these claims." Richard's grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing. The empire he had spent his life building was teetering on the edge of collapse, and the son he had abandoned was now standing in front of him, watching it all fall apart. "We're working to get ahead of it," Alex had said, but Richard's head was spinning. Whistleblowers? From within his own company? How had he missed this? "Get this under control," Richard snapped, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound authoritative. "Do whatever you need to do to bury this. I'm not letting this destroy everything I've built." "We'll do our best," Alex replied cautiously. "But Mr. Caldwell, I need to be honest with you. This could get very messy. You should prepare yourself for a fight." Richard hung up without another word, the walls of his office seemingly closing in on him. The once opulent space now felt suffocating. He stood there for a moment, staring blankly at the floor, trying to collect himself. Richard Jr. observed him, his face impassive. "Trouble, Dad?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. Richard shot him a sharp look. "This is none of your business." His son raised an eyebrow. "Actually, it is. This is all connected. You thought you could sweep everything under the rug. But the dirt always finds its way to the surface. And now people are starting to pay attention." Richard wanted to lash out, to tell his son to leave, but he knew Richard Jr. was right. The empire he had built one founded on power, manipulation, and control, was starting to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "You think you're so smart," Richard growled. "But you don't understand what it takes to build something like this. You have no idea the sacrifices I had to make." "Sacrifices?" Richard Jr. echoed, shaking his head. "You sacrificed us, your family. And now it's all catching up to you. This isn't about money, Dad. It's about accountability, something you've never had to face." Richard felt his anger swell, but it was mixed with something else. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being exposed for the man he truly was. He had always believed he could control everything in his life, that he could manipulate people and situations to his advantage. But now, the cracks were too deep to cover up. "I did what I had to do," Richard said quietly, his voice losing its edge. "I built something out of nothing. You can't understand that kind of pressure." Richard Jr. stepped closer, his eyes hard. "I understand more than you think. But this isn't just about what you built. It's about what you destroyed in the process. You hurt people, Dad. People like my mom, people who trusted you." Richard's heart sank at the mention of Sharon. He hadn't thought of her as anything more than a mistake, a problem he had dealt with and neatly tucked away. But now, through this lawsuit, and through their son, her presence in his life felt like an open wound. Before Richard could respond, there was a light knock on the door. Cassandra entered cautiously, glancing between father and son, clearly sensing the tension in the room. "Sir," she began carefully, "the shareholders are requesting an emergency meeting. They've heard the news about the potential investigation, and they're concerned." Concerned. That word barely scratched the surface. If the shareholders turned against him, it wouldn't just be concern, it would be a full-blown revolt. His company, his legacy, would be at risk. Richard waved Cassandra away, though not before catching the look of pity in her eyes. She had been with him for years, always loyal, always professional. But even she seemed to sense that the end was near. When the door closed, Richard turned back to his son. "I'm not letting them take this company from me," he said, his voice shaking with determination. Richard Jr. stared at him, a look of quiet resignation on his face. "This isn't just about the company, Dad. This is about everything you've done, everything you tried to bury. You can't run from it anymore." Richard felt his chest tighten as the truth of his son's words sank in. He had been running for so long, hiding behind his wealth and power, believing he could escape the consequences of his actions. But now, there was nowhere left to run. He sat down heavily in his chair, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. His son remained standing, watching him with a mixture of disappointment and sadness. "I don't know what to do," Richard whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. For the first time, Richard Jr.'s expression softened. He stepped forward, standing directly in front of his father. "Maybe it's time to face the truth, to stop hiding." Richard looked up at his son, feeling a pang of regret so deep it was almost unbearable. He had spent his life building walls around himself, shutting everyone out. He had convinced himself that his empire was the only thing that mattered. But now, as he sat in his crumbling fortress, he realized how alone he truly was. "I don't know how," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard Jr. knelt down in front of his father, meeting his eyes. "It's not too late. But you have to stop fighting the truth. You have to own up to what you've done." Richard felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He hadn't cried in years, decades even. But now, as he faced the reality of his choices, the weight of it all was overwhelming. Before he could respond, the door to the office opened again. This time, it was Sharon. Richard's heart stopped. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She looked different than he remembered, stronger, more determined. The years hadn't worn her down. If anything, they had made her more formidable. She stepped into the room, her eyes locked on Richard. There was no anger in her gaze, no hatred, just quiet resolve. Richard Jr. stepped back, giving his mother space as she approached Richard's desk. The moment felt heavy, thick with the weight of everything unsaid over the past decades. Richard stared at Sharon, feeling the crushing force of his past choices bearing down on him. He had never expected to face this moment. And then, without warning, Angela spoke the words that would change everything. "I'm not here for revenge, Richard," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm here for the truth, and you owe it to us all." Richard stared at her, the simplicity of her request hitting him like a blow. The truth. It was something he had avoided for so long, hiding behind his success and the walls of power he had carefully built around him. But now, there was no more hiding. The walls were crumbling, and escape was no longer an option. Angela stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "You've built your life on lies, Richard. Lies to yourself, to your family, to everyone around you. But those lies can only take you so far." Richard Jr. stood silently at the side, his presence a constant reminder of everything Richard had tried to forget. Now, the truth was rising to the surface, and it could no longer be ignored. "I'm not here to destroy you," Angela continued, her voice still steady but full of conviction. "I'm not here to take your company or seek revenge, but I won't let you keep pretending. You need to face what you've done to us, to the people you've hurt." Richard felt a lump form in his throat, his carefully constructed defenses starting to crack. He had spent so long justifying his actions, convincing himself that the sacrifices he made were for the greater good. But now, as he looked into Sharon's eyes, he couldn't deny the truth anymore. He had hurt people who had trusted him, who had believed in him, and in his relentless pursuit of success, he had left behind a trail of broken promises and shattered lives. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Richard said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "I thought I was doing what was best. I thought I could control everything." Angela shook her head slowly. "You can't control everything, Richard. Life doesn't work that way. You've spent your life trying to bend the world to your will, but all you've done is push people away." Richard swallowed hard, the truth of her words settling in. He had pushed everyone away, Sharon, their son, even the people at his company, who had once believed in him. Now he was standing on the edge of a precipice, with nothing to hold on to but the crumbling remains of the empire he had built. "I don't know how to fix this," Richard admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't even know where to start." Sharon's gaze softened, and for the first time in years, Richard saw a glimpse of the woman he had once loved, the woman he had abandoned. "The truth is a good place to start," she said gently. "You need to stop running from it." A tear slipped down Richard's cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. For years, he had maintained a facade of strength and control, but now he felt exposed in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades, and it terrified him. "I hurt you," Richard said, his voice cracking. "I hurt both of you." Angela nodded, her eyes filled with sadness, but also with understanding. "You did, and it took me a long time to come to terms with that. But I'm not here to make you suffer. I just want you to acknowledge what you've done, to take responsibility." Richard Jr. stepped forward, his expression serious, but not hostile. "She's right, Dad. This isn't about tearing you down. It's about making things right, as much as you can." Richard looked between his son and Sharon, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life chasing power, chasing success. But now, in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the people he had hurt, the people he had abandoned in his pursuit of something that now felt empty. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm so sorry for everything I've done. I thought I was doing what was right, but I see now that I was wrong. I hurt you, Sharon. I hurt our son. And I can't undo that." Angela nodded, her eyes filled with both sorrow and a glimmer of hope. "You can't change the past, Richard, but you can decide what kind of man you want to be going forward." Richard wiped the tear from his cheek, his heart heavy with regret, but also with a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't running from the truth. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew he had to face it. "What do you want me to do?" Richard asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Angela took a step closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You need to own what you've done. Start with the lawsuit. Take responsibility. Apologize not just to me, but to everyone you've wronged. And more than that, make real changes." Richard Jr. nodded in agreement, his tone softer than before. "It's not too late to make amends, Dad. But it starts with you facing the consequences, not avoiding them." Richard looked at them both, feeling overwhelmed, but also strangely liberated. He had spent his entire life fighting for control, for power. But now, it was time to let go. Time to face the truth. "I'll do it," Richard whispered, his voice steadying. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Angela looked at him thoughtfully. "I don't want your money, Richard. I want you to take responsibility for your actions, for the people you've hurt. And that starts with the lawsuit. Don't fight it. Own up to what you've done." Richard nodded slowly. He had spent his entire life fighting to win, fighting to protect his empire, fighting to maintain control. But now, he realized the fight hadn't been worth it. He'd already lost too much. "I'll do it," Richard said, his voice growing steadier. "I won't fight the lawsuit. I'll own up to everything." Angela gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, and Richard Jr. stepped closer, resting a hand on his father's shoulder. "That's a start," his son said quietly, though his tone was firm. "But this is just the beginning. You've got a long way to go." Richard looked up at his son, feeling a mixture of pride and shame. Richard Jr. was everything he had never allowed himself to be: strong, principled, compassionate. In this moment, Richard felt the weight of what he had missed. He had lost the chance to be a father, to watch his son grow, to guide him and be present for him. And that was something he could never get back. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rebuild, to create something real. In the days that followed, Richard began the painful process of unraveling the life he had so carefully constructed. He cooperated fully with the lawsuit, confessing to the deals he had manipulated, the shortcuts he had taken, and the people he had wronged. The media was relentless in its coverage, and his company's stock plummeted as the truth was exposed. Shareholders were outraged, and the board unanimously demanded his resignation. But Richard didn't fight it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to hold on to control. He was letting go. Angela and Richard Jr. remained in his life, not as adversaries, but as reminders of the person he had been, and the person he still had a chance to become. Their relationship was delicate, fragile even, built on a foundation of decades of hurt and betrayal. But there was something new, something small but significant: hope. Maybe it was the beginning of forgiveness, or at least the first steps toward it. As Richard sat in his now empty office, watching the sun sink beneath the skyline, he realized that the empire he had built was gone. But in its place, there was something far more valuable. There was the possibility of redemption, and for the first time, he was willing to embrace it.